The air felt thick as I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at the severance package in my hands. The words blurred in front of me, my fingers trembling slightly as I held the paper. 3 months' salary, a number that seemed laughable when weighed against the years I had given to Grantwell Manufacturing. It was almost as if David Langston had calculated my reaction in advance, each line designed to strip away any illusion of fairness, to grind down the last shred of dignity I had left. I took a deep breath, pushing back the creeping anger that tried to claw its way up from my chest. Anger wouldn't help now. Not here. Not with the walls closing in. The sharp click of the kettle turning off was the only sound in the room, a sharp contrast to the chaos swirling in my mind. I poured the boiling water slowly, each drop steady and deliberate, as if it could calm my thoughts. But the truth, the one thing I couldn't escape, was that this wasn't just about the pension. It was about power. And David Langston had shown me just how far he would go to hold on to it. As the steam rose from my mug, I let myself sink deeper into my thoughts, piecing together the events of the last few months. I had seen the signs, the slow erosion of my position, the meetings I wasn't invited to, the whispers that never quite made it to my ears but always seemed to hang in the air, thick with implication. And all of it had led me to this moment. One single misstep, one wrong word, and I had become an obstacle to be removed. But I wasn't just going to roll over. Not this time. The folder on David's desk had been a symbol of his control. The manila pages meant to shove me out with a smile, with no regard for the decades I'd spent building something worthwhile. It was a calculated move, perfectly timed. My pension would vest on Monday, 3 days away, but I had been cut loose just in time. He wasn't just letting me go. He was robbing me. I could still hear his voice in my mind. Effective immediately. A line delivered so casually, as though my entire career had been nothing more than a blip on his spreadsheet. He thought he had won. But I wasn't going down that easily. I hadn't expected to be so calm, so collected in the face of it all. When he'd handed me the folder, his fingers tapped it with a sense of finality that had almost made me laugh. He had anticipated a scene, but all he had gotten was silence. Because this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a random act. This was a calculated decision, years in the making, and I was no longer just the senior compliance officer at Grantwell Manufacturing. I was a woman who knew too much. A woman who had kept the secrets of the company longer than I cared to admit. The severance package, 3 months' salary, a legal trap, wasn't just a payoff. It was an invitation to disappear. But they had miscalculated one thing. Me. As I sipped my tea, my mind raced, connecting the dots, piecing together the financial irregularities I had flagged over the years, the patterns that had been ignored, buried in favor of more pressing matters. What David Langston had been doing in the shadows, I had known all along. He had thought that cutting me loose would be the final step in his clean sweep, but the truth had a way of surfacing, and I had made sure of that. Every memo, every report, every backdated document, it was all there, waiting to be uncovered. I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, each second a reminder that I had a limited window to act. I glanced at the severance package again. If I signed it, it would be over. They'd win. I'd be out. But if I didn't, if I fought back, there was a chance, however slim, that I could turn the tide. I wasn't done yet. The kettle whistled again, and I poured another cup of tea. The decision wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I would fight this, with everything I had. David Langston had made a grave mistake. He had underestimated me, and I wasn't about to let him get away with it. The moon hung low in the sky as I walked back to my home office, each step measured and deliberate. The weight of the manila folder still lingered in my hands, but it was the contents of the fireproof lockbox that consumed my thoughts. For 4 years, I had played the role of the diligent, invisible observer, gathering fragments of evidence that no one had asked for, but everyone would eventually need. I never planned to use them, not until I was forced to. And now, it seemed, the time had come. I opened the box slowly, the familiar smell of old paper filling the air. Behind the family photo albums, carefully tucked away as if to shield them from prying eyes, was my insurance policy. Loan applications with falsified data, quarterly reports with numbers twisted beyond recognition, and emails instructing staff to backdate certifications. It was all there, a mosaic of fraud that had grown under David Langston's direction like a cancer. More than 1,000 pages, each one a nail in the coffin of the company's integrity. My hand hovered over my phone. The number was one I hadn't dialed in years. Gregory Santos. The name felt like a lifeline in this sea of deceit. Gregory had been Grant Wells' CFO before leaving for the SEC. He had respected my persistence, even when others saw it as unnecessary. But Gregory didn't just see the details, he understood the implications. I hit the call button. The conversation the next morning was longer than I anticipated, but clear. Gregory's response had been methodical, measured, yet unwavering. This isn't just wrongful termination, Melody. This is far worse. Based on what you're describing, Grant Well could be facing serious securities violations. His words cut through me like a blade, sharp and chilling. The pension timing was no accident, he explained. This wasn't just a dismissal. It was a calculated move. And it wasn't just my future on the line. It was a corporation's stability. Gregory had gone over my options, outlining the whistleblower protections available through the CC. He arranged for me to meet with his team on Monday morning. "Don't sign anything," he warned. "Secure those documents. Make sure they're safe." I spent Saturday with laser focus, copying every document, meticulously organizing the evidence into a chronology, indexing it all like a soldier preparing for battle. 3 identical packages, one for the SEC, one for my personal records, and one that I would keep for leverage, just in case. The phone calls came throughout the day. Janet from HR. David Langston, the company's general counsel. I ignored each one, watching as their desperation grew in the form of increasingly urgent voicemail messages. "Melody, we need that paperwork signed today." David's voice crackled through the speaker, an edge of panic in his tone. "I can come by and pick it up if that helps." The legal counsel was even more direct, his voice cold, demanding. "Failure to comply could jeopardize your severance package entirely." The threat was clear. They were on the edge, and they needed me to cave before the weekend ended. I had no intention of signing, no intention of being silenced, but they didn't know that yet. At 4:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat. I walked quietly to the door, peering through the peephole. There he was, David Langston, standing in front of my modest home like a predator in a suit. His expensive designer clothes felt out of place in this quiet neighborhood, and I could hear the impatience in his voice as he called through the door. "Melody, I know you're in there. This is ridiculous. Just sign the papers, and we can all move on." I didn't answer him. I stood still, watching him place the envelope in my mailbox before retreating to his luxury sedan. Only then did I retrieve it, the familiar envelope feeling heavier than it should. Another copy of the agreement, this time with a handwritten note. "Final opportunity, signed by 9 a.m. Monday." I set the envelope aside. That evening, Elizabeth called for our weekly chat. Her voice, always so full of life, now held an edge of concern. "Mom, you sound different. What's going on?" Her worry hit me harder than I expected, but I knew she deserved the truth. "I was terminated yesterday." What? But you're just days away from your full pension. They can't do that. She sounded so incredulous, so angry on my behalf, but I didn't feel the anger. Not anymore. They did, I said quietly. But don't worry, I'm handling it. I refused to let her come back home. She had her own life to live. I would take care of this myself. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness, the weight of the night pressing in. My mind kept returning to Monday's meeting with the SEC. For years, I had tried to address these issues internally, placing my faith in the system, in the company's integrity. But Grantwell had made its choice. Now, I would make mine. I wouldn't sign their agreement. I wouldn't be silenced. And I would not let them erase 3 decades of my life without paying for it. Monday arrived like the calm before a storm, with an eerie clarity that cut through the fog of uncertainty that had clouded my mind for weeks. The morning felt different, charged with purpose, as if the universe itself was aligning to push me forward. I dressed carefully, the sharp creases in my navy suit mirroring the sharpness of my resolve. I placed my documentation into a secure briefcase, each folder a silent witness to the years I'd spent digging for the truth. Years of quiet resistance, all leading to this moment. As I drove downtown, I couldn't help but think back to my first day at Grantwell. It seemed like a lifetime ago, back when I believed in the system, when I trusted that integrity would always win. But trust had betrayed me. Now, I was about to take a step that would shatter everything I'd worked for, and yet, I felt an undeniable sense of rightness in it. This wasn't just about me. It was about standing up for what was right, for what had been buried beneath layers of greed and manipulation. The federal building loomed ahead, an imposing structure of glass and steel, its quiet halls echoing with whispered conversations. Gregory met me in the lobby, his face a bit more weathered, but his sharpness intact. I saw the familiar flicker of recognition in his eyes as he shook my hand. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances," he said, his voice warm but tinged with the gravity of the situation. I nodded, managing a small smile. "It's good to see you, Gregory. Thank you for taking this seriously." He led me to a conference room where 2 other investigators were waiting. Angela Brennan, a senior enforcement attorney, and James Weston, a forensic accountant. Both greeted me with professional courtesy, but I could see the intensity in their eyes, the unspoken understanding that we were stepping into something much larger than a simple corporate dispute. "Mrs. Reynolds," Angela began, her voice calm but firm. "Before we start, I want to confirm that you understand the process we're initiating today. Once you share this information with us, an investigation becomes official. There's no turning back." I met her gaze, my resolve hardening. "I understand completely." For the next 3 hours, I walked them through my documentation. Every financial anomaly, every backdated report, every pattern of manipulation that had grown more aggressive under David Langston's leadership. I explained how shipments didn't match invoices, how quality control certifications were altered after products had been shipped, how the company had begun to overstate revenues at an alarming rate, 18% in the past 2 years alone. James, who had been silently reviewing the financial documents, looked up, his face tightening in concern. "These discrepancies aren't small," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "This is securities fraud." Angela's gaze never wavered as she asked, "And you reported these issues internally?" I nodded, pulling out copies of my memos and emails. Each time, I was told the issues were being addressed, or that I was misinterpreting the data. When David came on board, my concerns were redirected to his office, and that was the last I heard of it. Gregory leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You believe your termination was directly related to these reports?" "Without question," I replied, my voice steady but hard. "The timing alone makes it clear. But there's more. I had flagged several major issues with David's latest cost-cutting initiative. He needed me gone before I could escalate any further. As the meeting concluded, Angela outlined the next steps. We'll need your formal statement, then we'll begin our investigation, which typically remains confidential until we determine whether enforcement action is warranted. How long will that take? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. It varies, Angela replied. But given the documentation you've provided and the clear pattern of misconduct, we may move quickly on this one. I hadn't even made it home before my phone rang. Janet's name flashed across the screen. Her voice trembled when I answered. Melody, something's happening. The board just called an emergency meeting. David's been locked in his office all morning, and there are rumors about SEC investigators contacting our general counsel. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. So, it's begun faster than I anticipated. Did you? Janet hesitated, clearly struggling with the weight of what she was about to ask. Did you report something? I simply did what I should have done years ago, I replied, my voice low but resolute. What's happening with my pension paperwork? That's why I'm calling, Janet said, her voice laced with uncertainty. The executive committee is reviewing your termination. They've put everything on hold until further notice. An hour later, my phone rang again. This time, it was William Hargrove, the chairman of the board, the man who had barely acknowledged my existence during my time at Grant Well. His voice, usually so confident, now sounded strained, as if he was trying to maintain control in a situation rapidly slipping away. Ms. Reynolds, he said, his tone formal but laced with urgency. We seem to have a situation that requires your input. Would you be willing to come to the office tomorrow morning to discuss matters? I paused for a moment, considering the power dynamics at play. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mr. Hargrove, I replied, my voice steady and unwavering. Any discussions should include my attorney and potentially representatives from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I hung up, the finality of my words hanging in the air. This was no longer just about a termination. It was about a reckoning, and I was no longer afraid. I had nothing left to lose but the truth. And now, I had all the proof I needed to make them face it. The silence that hung between us was palpable, suffocating, as though the weight of unspoken truths pressed against the walls of the room. William Hargrove cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to signal a shift, a slight crack in the veneer of his usually unflappable confidence. I see, he finally said, his voice strained, but attempting to hold on to its authority. Perhaps we can arrange something more formal. I didn't respond. There was no satisfaction in his words, no vindication, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that washed over me. I had never wanted to be a whistleblower, never wanted to be the one to tear apart the fabric of a company I'd once believed in, that I'd devoted almost 3 decades of my life to. I had only wanted to do my job with integrity, to retire with the security I had earned, nothing more. But Grant Well had forced my hand. Now, it wasn't just my future on the line. It was everyone's, and we would all face the consequences of their actions. The phone calls began almost immediately after I hung up. Colleagues seeking information, executives scrambling for damage control. I ignored every single one of them. The time for private conversations had passed. Now everything would unfold in the public eye, in the harsh light of truth. By Wednesday morning, the storm had broken fully. The headlines hit the local business publications with the force of a thunderclap. SEC investigation into Grant Well Manufacturing. The company's stock began to plummet, its carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of its own corruption. Financial analysts who had lauded David Langston's cost-cutting measures only weeks ago were now questioning the integrity of the entire reporting structure. The tide had turned and there was no going back. In response, I received a formal letter from Grant Well's legal department. It was a transparent attempt at damage control, rescinding my termination and placing me on administrative leave with full benefits pending an internal review. It was far too little, far too late, but it was something. I knew their move was a desperate one, hoping that by offering me some semblance of security, they could delay the inevitable fallout, but they had underestimated the depth of what I had uncovered. At 10 o'clock a.m., my attorney, Barbara Reynolds, no relation, though the coincidence never failed to amuse us both, accompanied me to a meeting at Grantwell's headquarters. The same security guard who had escorted me out just days earlier now greeted us with a nod of respect as we passed through the building. The atmosphere inside was tense, the air thick with whispers. Employees huddled in corners, their conversations stalling abruptly as we walked by. We were led to the main boardroom, where William Hargrove sat waiting, accompanied by the company's outside counsel and 3 other board members. David Langston was conspicuously absent. I wasn't surprised. He was the architect of this mess, but now that the investigation had begun, he was likely hiding from the fallout. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Reynolds," William said, his voice strained as though the weight of the past few days had aged him. "We've initiated a comprehensive internal investigation into the concerns you've raised." Before I could respond, Barbara spoke, her tone sharp and unyielding. "Let's be clear about something, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice filling the room. "Ms. Reynolds didn't suddenly raise these concerns after her termination. She documented and reported them repeatedly over a period of 4 years, as her job required her to do. The company's decision to ignore those reports and then to terminate her just days before her pension vested speaks volumes." William shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unsettled by the truth that Barbara had just laid bare. "Yes, well, that's part of what we're investigating," he muttered, trying to regain control of the narrative. "I want to personally assure Ms. Reynolds that her termination has been rescinded," William continued. "We consider her an employee in good standing, with all benefits intact, including her pension." I cut him off, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. "Including my pension?" He nodded quickly. "Of course." "Good," I replied, my voice steady. "And what else?" William hesitated before adding, "In fact, we're prepared to offer you a consulting role after your retirement, which you can begin immediately if you wish. We value your expertise." I glanced at Barbara, who raised an eyebrow before speaking. "My client isn't making any decisions today," she said, her voice cool. "Any discussion about future arrangements should be preceded by a full accounting of how her previous concerns were suppressed." The meeting continued for another hour, the board members attempting to distance themselves from David's actions and the financial irregularities I had documented. They were trying to rewrite history, casting themselves as victims of misinformation. They expressed shock, disappointment, and even regret. But their words didn't carry any weight with me. These were the same people who had turned a blind eye for years. Now, when the truth was out in the open, they were scrambling to protect themselves. I remained mostly silent during their attempts to spin the situation, watching them, observing their body language. They had never noticed me before. Not really. I had always been the quiet one in the background, but now they couldn't look away. Their expressions were a mix of fear and something else, respect perhaps, or the realization that they had underestimated me. As we prepared to leave, William made one final attempt to sway me. "Melody," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "We're hoping you might consider speaking with the SEC investigators about the corrective actions we're taking. Your support would be invaluable." I looked at him directly for the first time, letting my gaze settle on him with a quiet intensity. "Mr. Hargrove, I've spent 29 years dedicated to this company's compliance. During that time, I filed 47 major reports documenting serious irregularities. I sent 16 memos specifically addressing the issues now under investigation. I requested 9 meetings with executive leadership to discuss these concerns, of which only 2 were granted, and neither resulted in any action. At what point in that history did I have your support? The room fell silent, and for a moment all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I could see the truth dawning on them. Their attempts to rewrite the past could no longer shield them from the facts. I'll cooperate fully with both the internal investigation and the SEC, I continued, my voice calm but resolute. But I'll be speaking only to the facts, as I always have. Whether those facts support or damage Grant Well will depend entirely on what you do next, not what you say in this room. The silence that followed was thick with tension, but it was no longer mine to carry. The truth was out, and now they would have to face the consequences. As Barbara and I made our way out of the building, her voice was soft but steady, a rare flicker of approval in her words. That was perfectly stated. But it wasn't until we reached the parking lot that I allowed myself the relief of a full breath. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation began to dissipate, leaving me both drained and clear-headed. This wasn't victory. Not yet. It was the beginning, just the beginning, of accountability. What happens now? I asked as we stood beside our cars, the weight of the meeting still hanging in the air. Barbara's smile was slight, almost imperceptible, but it held a knowing quality. Now, they scramble to save what they can while the investigation continues. Make no mistake, Melody, they're terrified of you. I shook my head slowly. They're not terrified of me. They're terrified of the truth. There's a difference. Barbara nodded thoughtfully, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. There is indeed, and that difference is why you'll win this, regardless of how it plays out. I drove home, the quiet hum of the car doing little to ease the churn of my thoughts. I wondered what Thomas would have thought of all this. My late husband had always been my champion, encouraging my meticulous nature even when others found it frustrating. Your attention to detail isn't a quirk, Melody, he would say. It's a superpower. Perhaps he had been right all along. By Friday, exactly 1 week after my termination, the story had evolved into a full-blown corporate scandal. The SEC had issued formal requests for information from Grant Well, and an internal memo from William Hargrove announced David Langston's immediate suspension, pending investigation. The company's stock had dropped nearly 30%, triggering alarm from major investors and partners. I was no longer just Melody Reynolds, the overlooked compliance officer. Business journals now referred to me as a whistleblower, the woman who had exposed Grant Well's corruption. The sudden attention was uncomfortable, but I remained focused. The investigation, after all, was still in its early stages. I continued working closely with the SEC investigators, who had set up offices in a separate building near Grant Well's headquarters. The evidence I had provided had opened many doors. And with each new discovery, the investigation was revealing even more troubling patterns. Gregory called that afternoon, his voice graver than I had ever heard it. Melody, it's worse than we thought, he said. The financial manipulation goes back at least 5 years, predating Langston. He accelerated it, but he didn't start it. I had suspected as much. I know, I replied quietly. There were irregularities I couldn't fully document because I couldn't access certain executive-level reports. Well, we can access them now, Gregory continued, his voice tight with disbelief. And they tell a story of systematic fraud designed to inflate the company's value. The board is claiming ignorance, but at least 3 members had to have known. They signed off on key transactions. This news should have been the vindication I had been waiting for, but instead, it left me feeling hollow. The company I had dedicated my life to had been corrupted at levels even I hadn't fully comprehended. The people I had trusted, the very individuals I had worked alongside for years, had been actively participating in the fraud I had been trying to expose. It felt like a betrayal that reached further than I had ever anticipated. That afternoon, I received a call from Elizabeth. Her voice was tight with anger, the concern in it unmistakable. "Mom, have you seen the news? They're trying to discredit you." I hadn't been following the media coverage, focusing instead on the official proceedings. "What are they saying?" I asked, keeping my tone calm. "They're claiming you had performance issues and were bitter about being passed over for promotion. David Langston gave an interview saying it was all personal, that you're retaliating because of personal grievances." I wasn't surprised. It was a predictable defense strategy: attack the whistleblower's credibility instead of addressing the allegations head-on. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. "It doesn't matter, Elizabeth. The evidence speaks for itself. My performance reviews have been exemplary for 29 years. They can't rewrite that history now." David was trying to do exactly that. By the evening, several news outlets had picked up his narrative, questioning my motives and suggesting I had manipulated documentation to frame him. It was a desperate move from a desperate man, but it still stung to see my integrity questioned so publicly. Barbara called immediately. "Don't respond to any of it," she advised. "The SEC will issue a statement tomorrow, clarifying your whistleblower status and the credibility of your evidence. Let the official channels handle this." I wasn't planning to respond, I told her, but I had something else in mind. The next morning, I drove to my local bank and asked to speak with Tracy Ferguson, the manager. I had known her for years, as she had handled most of Grant Wells' local banking transactions. "Melody!" Tracy greeted me warmly, her eyes reflecting the concern she had no doubt seen in the media. "I've been following the news. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Tracy," I replied, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "But I need access to my safe deposit box." She led me inside the private room, and I opened the box, retrieving a sealed envelope I had placed there 3 years ago. Inside were copies of email exchanges between David's predecessor and 2 board members discussing ways to manage financial appearances during a critical acquisition period. I had stumbled upon these while archiving old emails, and something had told me to secure them separately from my other documentation. At the time, I hadn't known what they meant, but now, they felt like the final piece of the puzzle. The truth was about to come crashing down, and I would make sure it was undeniable. I hadn't included these emails in my initial SEC report because they weren't directly related to the current issues. But now, with David Langston attempting to undermine my credibility, they provided the crucial context that would change everything. They demonstrated that the problematic practices at Grant Well Manufacturing had been in place long before my concerns about him ever arose. I called Gregory immediately. "I have something you need to see," I told him, my voice steady but urgent. It changes the narrative completely. As I drove to meet him, I felt no satisfaction in the discovery. Only a certainty that the full truth would now emerge, regardless of who it implicated. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Monday morning, 10 days after my termination, and 7 days after the SEC investigation became public. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be there to know what was happening. The additional documentation I had provided had accelerated the investigation dramatically, implicating not just David, but multiple board members in a years-long pattern of financial manipulation. Gregory called me from outside the meeting room. "It's chaos in there," he reported. "The SEC enforcement team just presented their preliminary findings. 3 board members have resigned on the spot. David is trying to claim he was just following established practices, but no one's buying it anymore." By noon, Grant Well issued a press release announcing a leadership restructuring and full cooperation with regulatory authorities. The carefully worded statement confirmed the resignation of 4 board members, including William Hargrove, and the termination of David Langston for cause. The company's stock, already battered, dropped another 12% that afternoon. My phone rang again. It was Janet from HR. "Melody, the interim CEO wants to meet with you tomorrow, if possible." The interim CEO, Patricia Donovan, had been the former chief operating officer. While she had always treated me with professional respect, there was no warmth between us. I agreed to the meeting, but insisted it take place at my attorney's office. When Patricia arrived the next day, she looked exhausted but determined. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Melody," she began, "the company is in crisis, and you're at the center of it. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you were the only one who consistently did what was right." She slid a folder across the table, eerily similar to the termination paperwork David had presented just 11 days earlier. "This officially rescinds your termination, reinstates your employment retroactively, and confirms your full pension vesting," she explained. "It also includes an additional compensation package, recognizing the difficulties you've experienced." I opened the folder. The compensation package included a sum equal to 5 years of my salary, full healthcare coverage for life, and a formal apology from the board. "We're also establishing a new corporate ethics division," Patricia continued. "We'd like you to help design it as a consultant after your retirement. Your experience is invaluable." I closed the folder without commenting on the offer. "And David Langston? The board members involved?" Patricia's expression hardened. "Criminal charges are expected. The company will not be defending them." Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived at Grantwell Manufacturing. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom watching as David Langston and 2 former board members entered guilty pleas to securities fraud charges. The man who had so casually ended my career now looked diminished, his arrogance replaced by defeat. Our eyes met briefly as he turned to leave, and I saw recognition in his gaze. Not of me specifically, but of what I represented, the consequences of his actions personified. The Well scandal had become a case study in corporate governance failures and the crucial role of internal compliance. I had declined the consulting position with the reorganized company, choosing instead to work with regulatory agencies to develop better whistleblower protocols. My story had inspired other compliance officers to come forward with their own documentation of corporate wrongdoing, creating a ripple effect across industries. The SEC had awarded me a substantial whistleblower payment, 15% of the penalties assessed against Grantwell, combined with my pension and the settlement. I now had more financial security than I'd ever imagined possible. I established a scholarship fund for women pursuing careers in corporate ethics and compliance, naming it after Thomas. Elizabeth had relocated to St. Paul to be closer to me, bringing my 2 grandchildren with her. We spent weekends together at my new lakeside home, building memories I had missed while working all those long hours. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset over the water, Elizabeth asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mom, do you regret staying at Grantwell all those years, given how it ended?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I finally answered. "I regret that it was necessary to expose them, but I don't regret my work there. Integrity isn't just about being honest when it's easy. It's about maintaining your principles even when, especially when, it costs you something." Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "You taught me that, you know. Not with words, but by example." That, I realized, was perhaps the most meaningful outcome of all. Not the vindication, not the financial security, but the knowledge that my choices had shown my daughter what it meant to stand firm in your values, regardless of the consequences. As for Grantwell Manufacturing, the company had survived, though greatly diminished. The new leadership had implemented stringent compliance protocols and transparent reporting practices. They still sent me their annual reports, perhaps as a reminder, perhaps as an apology. I read them carefully, noting the improved practices with professional satisfaction. Some might see my story as one of revenge, but I've never viewed it that way. I simply did what I had always done: documented the facts, reported the truth, and stood by my findings. The difference this time? Finally, others were forced to listen.